The next hour is presented by our talented young researchers working in the Bay Area. Their work complements the Haywired scenario.
Hello and welcome. My name is Tamika Bassman. I'm an analyst with Arup Advanced Technology and Research in San Francisco. Analyses of the Haywired scenario have been completed, but the work to inform earthquake risk reduction continues. This time is to recognize some of the emergent research and researchers in the Bay Area that are working in this space. Today's presentations span a breadth of interesting subject areas. They expand on Haywired water supply outage analyses, utilize novel highway bridge retrofit strategies, characterize vulnerabilities in tall steel frame buildings, evaluate tall building functional recovery, illustrate disruptions from dangerous tall buildings on downtown districts, demonstrate high-resolution seismic risk assessment at the city scale, incorporate structural and community vulnerability in housing recovery modeling, contrast housing recovery in the short and long term, and show how community change comes about when voices are heard. We are very excited to share this work with you, and without further ado, let's begin with our first presenter.
Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Toland, and on behalf of my co-author Ann Wine, we're here to present our paper on a simplified method for rapid estimation of emergency water supply needs after earthquakes, which we developed for the Haywired scenario and are showcasing today in the student research panel and the Volume 3 rollout. In our paper, we develop an innovative approach for the estimation of emergency water supply needs in earthquakes, such as in the Haywired scenario. Our method is performed without proprietary water pipeline infrastructure inventory data, which can be prohibitively time-consuming and coordination-intensive to collect within or after a no-notice earthquake event in a large complex region like the San Francisco Bay Area, which may include over 30 individual utility districts. Our method allows for estimation of households with emergency water resource needs at an increased precision over other simplified methods, which can be used by emergency managers for targeted resources allocation, rapid assessment, prioritization, and identification of the most severely impacted communities. These precision estimates are also used for ensuring resource access in the most vulnerable communities and communities that might have a disparity for resource access and risk. Our methodology is based upon the observation that in social implications, we're looking at households that are impacted rather than on the restoration and repair of infrastructure components. So we can bypass the identified infrastructure just by looking at the break rates themselves and utilizing the simplified serviceability functions that allow us to compute water service outage. From this, we're able to estimate the water supply needs across the Bay Area at a 250 meter grid cell resolution. And in our study, we developed some sensitivity analysis and validation to ensure that our method and results are consistent with other simplified approaches and that the relationships between serviceability and pipeline breaks are preserved. In time with the Haywired Volume 3 rollout, our work was published recently in the journal Water and is now available with the USGS Publications Warehouse. Please feel free to read the article and to formulate any questions. We'll be available at the 3:00 p.m. panel for discussion, and I'm also always available for any follow-up emails, and I've attached my contact and other pertinent information below. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here today. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about a project titled Use of Corridors for Decision-Making Transportation Networks Inside the Bridges, developed by me, Rodrigo Silva Lopez, and Professor Chad Baker at Stanford University. We know that road networks are vulnerable to earthquakes, and we don't need to go that far to find evidence of this vulnerability. After the Loma Prieta earthquake of 1989, bridges in the Bay Area experienced profound damage. Here on the left, we remember damage that was observed in the Bay Bridge, and here in the right figure is some damage that the Cypress Viaduct on East Bay, really close to the Haywired Fault, showed how damaged it was, and unfortunately it killed 42 people. This happened with an earthquake was dozens of miles away from the actual Bay Area. So this makes us wonder what would happen if the Haywired Fault would experience an earthquake. Motivated by this, decision makers are actually looking for effective ways to retrofit and manage size risk. In that context, in this study, we propose the use of corridors as an effective tool to retrofit bridges. A corridor is a group of bridges that work together. Here, we're showing an example of a real-life corridor in which bridges are interlocated with each other and they actually work together. And so this bridge goes over this bridge, and in case this bridge fails, this bridge will also be affected. And in that regard, to minimize risk, both bridges should be retrofitted jointly. Given that this is an optimization, the optimization that we propose is to minimize the cost of intervention action, which is retrofitting and also repairing bridges after an earthquake, subject to acceptable measures of increasing travel time, and also enforcing that bridges within a corridor should be retrofitted together. When it comes to results, comparing the corridor optimization to other strategies such as PageRank, measure of neutrality, and optimization that doesn't use corridors, the corridors performs better for different amount of retrofitted bridges. As a result of this study, first, corridors capture realistic setups, and also using corridors support optimization minimizes traffic disruption due to earthquakes. Of course, there are more details in this model, and if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me, rcl@stanford.edu, or look for the publication on the website at www.rclopez.com. Thank you for your time.
Hello, everyone. My name is Francisco Galvez, and I am a fifth-year PhD student at Stanford University. My work really focuses on the so-called pre-Northridge welded steel mount frames, which are a type of building that's very common throughout the United States, and that after the Northridge earthquake, it was clear that they don't really perform as expected during earthquakes. And the reason being the performance of their beam-to-column connections. However, despite that those vulnerabilities were identified nearly 25 years ago, we as a society haven't been able to develop policy that address this latent risk. So the reason that explains that lack of policy is that we don't really have reliable risk metrics that give us a grip of the problem so that we can then develop good mitigation approaches to reduce that risk. So here my work really tries to provide tools to quantify or to reach those risk metrics that to then inform policy. This chart here kind of summarizes the main contributions of my work, starting on the left with developing a detailed database of welded steel mount frames that goes beyond the typical scope of an inventory and captures the structural details that really affect the performance of buildings. I also developed high fidelity model for this beam-to-column connection that control the performance of these buildings. And then merging those two, and we can then build nonlinear structural models of several archetypes that represent the wide variety of tall welded steel mount frames that we find in our cities to estimate the risk in terms of safety, economic loss, and downtime. And with those, then we can do a couple of things. The first is to develop damage indicators that can expedite post-earthquake decision-making. Things like, can I stay in my building despite that has suffered a few fractures? Or do I need to leave and evacuate? Or even do I need to put a cordon around this building? So these are all questions that we don't really know how to decide. And with this type of damage indicators, we can inform this type of decisions. And then the final step is to then analyze what are the implications at the community level, thinking community in this case is downtown San Francisco, of what are the implications of the damage of these buildings. And here is where the Haywired scenario becomes really important, because to communicate this to the public, we need to join our engineering simulations with a realistic scenario that's easy to convey. And that's our last step, but we also want to harness some of the high computing powers and new developments by the Sim Center to estimate those implications. So really happy to discuss more. Thank you very much for coming to this presentation. Yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions and discussions. Thanks.
Hello everyone, I'm Pritish Kapoti, a PhD candidate at UBC Vancouver, representing the team who contributed to the ATC 119 project for the City and County of San Francisco. And today I'm going to briefly talk about a few highlighting outcomes of this project pertaining to functional recovery performance of tall buildings. In the context of the recently released FEMA PEEP 2090 report, this work provides insights into how tall buildings design criteria relates to functional recovery performance. We examined the expected performance of two modern archetype buildings, a 42-story reinforced concrete residential building and a 40-story steel buckling restraint brace frame office building in San Francisco. Both the archetypes are designed following non-prescriptive procedures, and their seismic performance is evaluated for ground motions consistent with design level earthquake as well as risk-targeted maximum considered earthquake. Despite moderate story drift ratios for both these archetypes and acceptable direct repair cost estimates, downtime to functional recovery far exceeds recovery goals set by the city. Here I'll use results for the RC shear wall archetype for design level earthquake to underline this observation. This archetype for design level earthquake yields story drift ratio of 0.8%, which is less than half of the building code limit, and the estimated repair cost is 7.7% of the building replacement cost. However, the downtime to functional recovery estimate is in the order of 7.5 months, way longer than the tentative recovery goal of weeks. To address such extensive downtime, we evaluate the impact of recovery-based design guidelines for reducing recovery times through more stringent drift limits under expected ground motions and measures to mitigate externalities that impede recovery. Implementing both of which reduces the downtime to functional recovery from 7.5 months to just over 2 months. This work has been recently published in Earthquake Spectra, the QR code for which is given on the slide, and I'll be happy to address questions or comments in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Ann Halsey and I'm going to discuss how post-earthquake safety cordons can impact the recovery of downtown San Francisco. I try to support community resilience plans that look at recovery targets like what you see here. We have key functions and then we also have time targets for when we want those functions to come back online after an earthquake. But these are considering specific hazard levels, in this case looking at a magnitude 7.2 on the San Andreas. I'm going to show the results for this, but then I'm also going to show what the results would be considering the Haywired scenario instead. The framework uses high-resolution simulation, which means that we're considering the damage to each individual building, and in particular, whether the damage would require a safety cordon around it, which would mean that none of the surrounding buildings could be accessed, even if they themselves are not damaged. We're going to plot these results on a recovery curve, showing how the community progresses through its recovery over time. But here we're only showing one simulation. We're actually going to do this for many simulations to consider the uncertainty in the system. We're going to think about this in terms of our recovery targets, which can be plotted on top of these recovery curves. If we count the number of simulations that are above that curve, that's going to give us the probability of achieving this 4-month time target. And we can also do the same thing considering a 12-month target. We can then plot these probabilities of 50% functionality on the x-axis, looking at both the 4 and the 12-month time targets. We can compare this baseline case to what would happen if we ignore the cordons, overestimating our community's recovery. Furthermore, we can look at various mitigation strategies to see how these strategies would improve our probabilities of achieving 50% functionality. But we can also consider the Haywired scenario. And here we see that the additional distance from our downtown San Francisco site and the reduced magnitude is going to change how the community is going to be affected by this earthquake. We have a higher probability of 50% functionality at the 4 and 12 months than we would have for the larger, closer earthquake. So this framework lets us consider the probability of meeting various time targets, how different mitigation strategies would help to improve those probabilities, and furthermore, how these probabilities would change depending on what earthquake scenario we're looking at. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Tamika Bassman. Today, I will be providing you an overview of our recent work studying seismic risk in the city of Alameda, California, from a Haywired scenario rupture event. Alameda is an island city located in the East Bay, with a growing population and aging building stock. Alameda's close proximity to the Haywired Fault, as well as an abundance of man-made, highly liquefiable fill deposits underlying parts of the city, renders seismicity one of the most important hazards the city faces. Our work comprises a high-fidelity, Monte Carlo-based seismic risk assessment of Alameda using a magnitude 7 Haywired Fault rupture scenario. In the following slides, we will go over 3 aspects of this work regarding building inventory generation, liquefaction hazard simulation, and use cases for high-resolution analysis results. Generating a high-fidelity building inventory from publicly available datasets poses a number of challenges. Multiple datasets from various sources must be collected to cover all the necessary information. They come in varying file formats and structures and at varying resolution, such as parcel level or census block level. Uncertainty quantification is required to bring lower resolution datasets up to a higher level of granularity while maintaining reasonable accuracy. Different datasets will also commonly contain conflicting information or have sparsely populated fields, both of which must be handled robustly. The result of overcoming these challenges is a generalizable approach for building inventories that can be applied to other regions. We also developed a generalizable approach for incorporating liquefaction into the high-resolution regional hazard simulations. It starts with gathering soil profile and groundwater table elevation data taken from numerous borehole logs across the city. This information is combined with simulated shake maps as inputs to a set of soil mechanics-based calculations to output estimates of liquefaction-induced ground deformation at each borehole location. A spatial interpolation scheme is then employed to arrive at simulated maps of both vertical settlement and lateral spreading at all building locations across the island. High-resolution results of our probabilistic analysis workflow, such as maps of building damage state across the island, have a number of uses. In addition to the ability to visualize spatial trends in detail, losses can be disaggregated to determine the physical or demographic groups that dominate in terms of severity of consequence. This information can be useful to local stakeholders and decision makers in providing actual numbers that can help rank and prioritize different mitigation measures, and these measures can themselves be modeled directly within the workflow to illustrate their impact on post-disaster consequences.
The purpose of this project was to create a method for communities to use to understand their vulnerability and resilience in a more comprehensive way. We wanted to explore the interactions between structural vulnerability and social vulnerability to earthquakes. Since policy decisions tend to be made on a city scale, it was important that our analysis could provide high-resolution results. To do this, we created a framework by considering 3 components of vulnerability that affect a community's ability to recover after an earthquake. The first is structural vulnerability, the expected damage to buildings. The second is social vulnerability, the presence of socioeconomic and demographic characteristics that make some residents more vulnerable than others. And lastly, neighborhood damage concentration. Experts have found that areas with high concentrations of structural damage may see many of their residents choosing to move out of the community rather than completing repairs. To show how this framework can be applied, we conducted a case study in the city of Berkeley, California. For this study, we considered only residential buildings. On the left, we see that the buildings with the highest expected recovery times are toward the northeast part of the study area. In the center, we see that the most socially vulnerable residents are more towards the southwest part of the study area. Lastly, we see that the majority of the neighborhoods, except for the ones in green in the very north, are at risk of this increased outmigration due to high neighborhood damage concentration. This analysis can also be used to compare recovery times of various subsets of the population and identify groups that may have disproportionately high recovery times. Here, we see that multifamily homes are expected to have slower recovery times than single-family homes, and that groups such as renters, low-income households, and more socially vulnerable households are expected to have slower recovery than their counterparts. This can be useful in future applications like policy evaluation. For example, a building retrofit policy can be modeled at the structural damage estimation stage, and the resulting recovery times of different groups like the ones shown here can be looked at. This analysis is dependent on the availability of high-resolution, reliable data, which can be difficult to find. However, hopefully this study shows the value of collecting this data for future use.
Hi, my name is Rodrigo Costa, and for the next 2 minutes, I'll tell you how myself and my colleagues here at Stanford integrated place attachment into housing recovery simulations to estimate population losses. This research is motivated by some of the findings from the Haywired scenario. The Haywired identified that young and moderate to high income renters are very likely to leave the city after an earthquake because they have the means, they lack the social ties, and they lack the tolerance to stay in a community that has been damaged by an earthquake. But this is all about short term. We wanted to look at the long term. What about during housing recovery? We wanted to also determine who will have the longest recovery times, who will have the highest cost to repair, and what are the demographics of the people that have low place attachment to begin with. So we used several tools that we have been developing over the several years to simulate recovery. These tools use data such as the hazard maps, data on buildings, and on the demographics of the population in the city, and they output housing recoveries as the ones you're seeing now. So we applied this model to study housing recovery in San Francisco after a large earthquake on the San Andreas Fault. And the questions we had were, who would have the highest cost recovery, the longest recoveries, and also have low place attachment? Because the combination of these three factors, we propose that will be a good indicator that those households would not be willing to stay in the city during recovery. Our main findings are summarized in this picture here, where we identified who are the households who will have a costly, long recovery time, and they have low place attachment to begin with. We identified that households that are low income, renters, and who occupy buildings that were built at low code are the most likely to do so. This highlights the differences between the people that are more likely to leave the community in the short term, identified in the Haywired scenario as high income renters, to in the long-term scenario identified by us as those with low income and who are also renters.
Welcome. We will be presenting on social cohesion, implications for disaster resilience for communities at risk in the Haywired scenario. My name is Jessica Campos.
And my name is Tarundeep Singh, and we are MPA candidates from San Francisco State University.
The data we are presenting has been collected from Cloverdale, California, part of a larger study. Please note the difference in response by language because of the likelihood it has with the Haywired scenario.
Both income and feeling one's voice is heard have impact on decision-making and are positively correlated with frequency volunteering, interacting with more organizations on a regular basis, and attending more community events. Voice having an impact also matters for feeling supported by the local government. If a community or a subset of a community voice is not being heard in the decision-making process, then that affects disaster preparedness decision-making. If a community or a sub-community is not being heard, then the issues of that community will also not be heard, and government and government agencies will not be aware of the needs and the issues of the community. They will also not be prepared to gather resources or resolve those issues as part of their pre-event disaster preparedness scenarios, which weakens a community's overall resilience and preparedness to face said disaster. To properly prepare for any disasters, those carrying out the relief efforts must prepare for as many scenarios and issues. So knowing which segment of the community feels unheard will allow those preparing for disaster to make a special effort to understand the issues of the subsection of the community. This will also allow them to better prepare before disaster occurs, which will make all the difference when any disaster situation actually occurs. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Your voice having an impact matters on its own, yet the factor of higher income results in ability to invest in emergency and pre-disaster preparation, both items kept at home and educational courses. In addition, research shows that people with higher income tend to be more involved civically. Prior research also displays that folks with higher income tend to be more resourced and feel more efficacy in their community, likely to increase their volunteer and engagement in their community. The graph here represents the data collected for annual income, similar to Cloverdale, which is 71,000 median income. Haywired has 86,000, which shows again the similarities of the data. Our findings reinforce existing research in disaster resilience. The factors include wealth and community involved in pre-event matters for outcomes in the wake of a disaster. Next slide. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tamika and researchers, for your lightning talks that use and complement the Haywired scenario towards strengthening infrastructure, improving response, anticipating recovery, and building community ties before the next earthquake in the Bay Area. We can meet these aspiring researchers in spatial chat at 3 o'clock.